you don't want to get going too late. So our next speaker is Adam Nally, Dr. Adam Nally. And as an international known speaker, Dr. Adam Nally puts a profoundly practical and charismatic effect on topics of importance. He creates a bridge for the average person to see and clearly understand deeply complex concepts in the medical world with his knowledge, humor, and endless bacon analogies. So I give you Dr. Adam Nally.
Thank you. Can you guys hear me okay? Is the mic all right? All right. I may move around, so I apologize to the cameraman ahead of time. I appreciate being here, and I'm grateful to all the vendors, and especially to Keto Chow for inviting us to be here. This is actually a lot of fun. How many of you are healthcare providers of some sort? Just want to get an idea. And how many are just the layperson starting keto? How many, this is your first month in keto or your first week? A couple, all right, so kind of have an idea of what we're doing. All right, fantastic. There's a little bit of feedback there.
Yeah.
Okay. I'm a board certified family physician. I'm a board certified obesity medicine specialist. I'm also a health policy fellow through the American Osteopathic Association. So I've delved in a lot of areas. I talk really fast. And so if you haven't buckled up your bootstraps and pulled on your suspenders, do so. I would also say pull out your cameras and get ready to take some pictures, because I'm going to give you some slides that may be somewhat complex, and there's a lot of information, and it's easier to take a picture than it is to take notes for some people. So I'd say feel free to do that. I hope this changes. Well, oh, there it is. Okay, perfect. So thank you. I have to tell you who I am a little bit in my disclosures. I'm the owner of DocMuscles.com, where I blog and post stuff, and I'm also the author of lead author of the Keto Cure. I'm the owner of a multivitamin company and also a distributor for a number of exogenous ketones. So I have to tell you a little bit about the disclosures there. I started this journey as a physician about 20 years ago, and my father, this is my dad. I grew up here in Orem, in this part of the valley. He's actually buried in American Fark, if I say that right. And he weighed about 400 pounds when he died at age 58. He was a type 2 diabetic, progressed to type 2 diabetes. He's on 150 units of insulin and 32 pills a day when he passed away. This is the last picture of him before he passed away. I'm going to bring this up a bit. And his labs and my labs in our early 30s looked identical. My concern was that as I entered medical school, the challenge was that when I came out of medical school, I weighed about 65 pounds heavier than I do today. And in the first 5 years of my practice, could not get the weight to come off, no matter how many calories I restricted, and no matter how many triathlons I ran, I could not get the weight to move, and I figured something's wrong here. So in the process, I went back to school and said, I want to learn about obesity, and became a specialist in obesity, and realized in that process that we've been doing it wrong for 50 years. And so you're going to see a component of that. And I'm going to start with dispelling some myths and then lead into how that affects the thyroid, which is one of 16 disease processes that I commonly treat every day. Dr. Ron, who's just here a little earlier, spoke last, talked about insulin resistance. That is a primary key factor. We're going to touch on that a little bit briefly and then move forward with that. But I want you to understand that. He showed you some great slides. I just want you to know that we are getting heavier and heavier as the time goes on. Right now, 38.5% obesity in the nation. The East Coast is the heaviest, and so that's the challenge, and we're catching up with it pretty quickly. So that's the big concern. I went to Disneyland, my kids, I've got older kids now, they're in their 20s, 18s and 20s, but in 2007 we took my kids to Disneyland, and my wife's favorite ride is It's a Small World, and it was closed, and we were all upset, especially my wife, very upset. They were replacing the boats and the flumes. That was the challenge. They needed larger buoyancy boats because they were bottoming out. We as a nation, as a people, were bottoming out the most famous ride in the world because we were 30% heavier than we used to be, and It's a Small World couldn't handle the size. So they replaced it over a 2-year period of time, and that's one of the big challenges that we found. The other concern is I'm former military, and there's a huge number of costs that go into a number of different things that we do. With this obesity that's there, we've had to increase the braking systems on all of our equipment, our airplanes and our buses, our trains. We've had to increase the size of stadium seating. We've had to relax. When I entered the military, the Air Force, we had to run 1.5 miles in a certain set amount of time. A year into the military, they relaxed that requirement and said you have to walk 1.5 miles in 45 minutes. I don't want a soldier who passes that requirement on my back. I want someone else that can help me, and that's a concern to me. We now have the Big John toilet seats. If you have not seen them, they're in most stadiums, and which was very loud and clear to me when my father passed away, is you have to get the double wide casket. It costs twice as much, but you have to buy the double wide casket, and that's a challenge, and this is more and more common as we move forward through the years. So in my office, the C word is a swear word, because these are little tiny creatures that live in your closet and sew your clothes tighter every night. Now, you saw this from Dr. Rigby, but you can see that amazingly, all of a sudden in the late 1970s, boom, there's this jump in obesity and overweight. And it's fascinating that that same year is the year that lovastatin, a cholesterol drug, was discovered, and that same year is the year that the food pyramid was designed. Now, the food pyramid changed. They kind of spread it around on a plate. We now call it the food plate, but it's the same. It really hasn't changed much. But you can see that we've been gaining weight incessantly, and diabetes follows that after that explosion that occurred in the early 70s. All right, so how does this affect our children? Well, I recall growing up as a kid watching the black and white Godzilla. And I loved it, because that was adventure. Well, now we introduced fishy crackers, and this is our Godzilla for our kids. So unicorns are real. It's just that they started eating low fat in the 70s, and we now call them rhinoceroses. So the challenge is we can only see a short distance ahead, but what we can see lights the way greatly. And what I hope to do is that you're going to take away something from this that may be significant for you, and it may be different for your neighbor, but there's a lot of information that I want you to pick up in your journey. Some of you may be early on in that journey, a week into this journey. Some of you may be as far as I am at 15 years into this journey. I've been ketogenic for 15 years, or close there too. My last meal, for those of you that are interested, was last night at 7 a.m. or 7 p.m. I got up this morning and spent an hour in the gym lifting weights, and I've been here the entire time. And so I'm going on probably 18 hours of no food, or will be by the time I have dinner. But I just am not hungry. And that's the benefit of a ketogenic diet, is it naturally causes these periods of not being hungry. But let's look specifically at what causes the obesity and the challenges that are there. Now, I'm a big fan of House, and House says, what I'm going to tell you goes against what you've been told for years. It goes against some very strongly held dogmatic beliefs. But truth is truth, and right and wrong does exist, so we're going to look at that. All right, so what actually causes obesity? My practice, we see about 13,000 patient visits per year. I have 2 PAs in my office. I've been in practice for 20 years. That's a lot of people. 85 to 90% of the people that walk through my doors have some degree of insulin resistance. So what that means is that if I give you a piece of bread, your body should produce a slice worth of insulin to help absorb the sugar in that bread. However, if you give me that same slice of bread, I produce 10 times the insulin in response to that piece of bread. So I store 10 times the fat, I make 10 times the cholesterol, I make 10 times the uric acid and risk for gout and kidney stones, and I have 10 times the increased risk for atherosclerosis and 10 times the increased risk for inflammation. I have patients in my office that produce 30 times the normal amount of insulin. All of us are somewhere along that spectrum. If you're insulin resistant, you may be more, you may be less. If I walk by the bakery, I gain weight. That's the challenge. So you have to be aware of that. So I say roughly 80 to 85%. I think it's more closely to 90 now, have insulin resistance and have this dysregulation of overproduction of insulin. We'll talk about that a bit. Sedentary lifestyle may play a role. I live on a farm, and the farmer that's next door to me, he gets on and off his tractor and pulls hay and does all the stuff with his cows. He burns 2,600 calories a day just doing what he does. That's the equivalent of running a marathon every day. I burn 300 calories a day walking from room to room and jumping to conclusions. So that's the difference between the two of us. There is a difference in what we're doing there, but that plays a role. And we're going to talk about thyroid as the tail end of this and how this affects it, and that's the metabolic deficiency, or one of the main ones that I see, and we'll delve into that fairly heavily. So this is a patient of mine. On the right-hand side, she's 7 years post-gastric bypass, regained 130 pounds after gastric bypass. They told her it would solve her problems. It did not. She came into my office in tears, could not lose weight. She was anemic, had horrible asthma. Her blood pressure was through the ceiling, fatty liver disease, and a whole slew of things that were happening. We put her on a ketogenic diet, and in 9 months, she lost 75 pounds, and she feels like a completely new woman. The challenge is I see this, After 5 years after gastric bypass, people start showing up in my office because this is what's happening. We're not fixing the problem, we're just putting a Band-Aid on it, and surgery's not. So the challenge in this life is not closing the gap between your actions and your belief. The challenge is closing the gap between your belief and the actual truth. So I hope I can present to you some science that gives you some valid truth that helps you make decisions on how you pick to use your meals and how you eat. So, 2 recent article questions, and I'm going to just go into this briefly, but why do popular self-help books, scholarly articles, media headlines still question the validity of the dietary calorie? Technically, in predicting energy deficit and accumulated excess. And the other question asks the same thing, and if we have all this data, why do we still use why do people still disagree with the calorie? Well, as I said, the calorie in my office is a swear word. We don't count calories. I don't want you to count calories because it doesn't work. It doesn't work for most of my patients, and the reason is this, and there are still people in the keto world that argue this, but I say to them, okay, yes, sure, we have the law of thermodynamics. The first law says you can't change energy. You can't destroy or remove energy in a closed system, you just change the form. So you have to account for all that energy, and we account for calories. But what the human body doesn't follow is the second law of thermodynamics. That's the equilibration of entropy. And the problem is that if you're a closed system like an ice cube, and I put you out there, entropy means that over time there's going to be this increased random change. The ice cube will melt and turn into water. That's true, but our bodies were designed to prevent entropy from happening, and that's what the second law of thermodynamics talks about. And diet and the human mammalian body does not follow the second law of thermodynamics. Basically, the problem is that we have hormones that block off these two boxes from working correctly to prevent us from working. So the calorie as a calorie theory doesn't work in the mammalian body. Random disorder increases over time. However, the body's designed to resist that disorder by hormonal counterbalance. It was briefly talked about, but it doesn't take into the hormones, and it doesn't take into the fact that ketones act like hormones, which we may touch on briefly as well. And then lastly, this basically, because you're maintaining weight in a system where you should be losing weight if you count calories, this is negative entropy. So basically, there are 4 laws of thermodynamics, not one. And if somebody says a calorie is a calorie, they need to understand the other 3 laws of thermodynamics and how that applies to the body. All right, so how do I know this? Well, over the 20 years of my lifetime, I love hormones. And these are the 38 hormones that allow you to gain or lose weight. All you have to do is understand that. And if you understand that, you will know exactly how to lose weight. But that is, as far as we know, the 38 hormones that resist entropy or change in the human body. And so, again, it violates that second law of thermodynamics. So this is my horse, Bailey. And good judgment comes from experience, and most of that comes from really bad judgment. So let's start with something simple. Your brain is the main organ in the body, and it wants glucose to be maintained for happiness between 70 and 100 milligrams per deciliter, or 3.9 to 5.3 millimoles per liter if you're from across the pond. But your brain wants that. That's what it wants. And it will do everything in its power to maintain that. It will override every other organ in your body to make sure that happens. And its best friend is the liver. And that liver, well, let me back up before I go there. So if your blood sugar drops below 80 milligrams, your insulin level begins to decrease. And then as it drops below 70, your glucagon, your epinephrine rises. And then if it drops below 67, norepinephrine and growth hormone rise. And then if it drops below 65, cortisol rises. And then if it drops below 55, you get dizzy, lightheaded, and have low blood sugar because your autonomic nervous system kicks in. Your brain controls this and tells your body to maintain the sugar so this doesn't happen. And that's what your body does. That's why people's blood sugars are where they're at, because of these hormones that are driving that process. Now, at under 50, brains aren't very happy. They don't function very well. Unless you give them ketones, then they do a little better. But the liver is the brain's best friend. Now, we've often said, well, the pancreas produces insulin, and the insulin lowers the blood sugar. That's actually not true. That's a secondary function. But that's what we were taught as a primary function in medical school. That's the challenge. The main job of the liver is to make sure that glucose stays somewhere between 70 and 95. That's what it does. And insulin acts as a counterbalance to raise or lower the signal to the liver. But we never took into account the 170 hormones produced by the fat cells. Now, fat cells, I was told in medical school, were there for cushion, keep us warm, and store energy. But in the last 10 years, we've realized that there's at least 170 hormones produced by fat cells, and we now know that at least 5 to 8 of them play a role in dramatically enhancing or affecting the way the liver produces glucose. So what happens is these hormones either suppress or increase or dampen the effect of insulin on the body. So let's say I get bigger, which I did, 65 pounds bigger. I now produce less adiponectin, less leptin essentially, more resistant, and I produce more of tumor necrosis factor alpha and interleukin 6, which happen to be the same hormones that cause cancer cells to grow faster. Those hormones actually suppress the effect of insulin. So when people wake up saying, Dr. Nally, I don't understand why my glucose is 106, it's because their fat cells are still overproducing these two hormones, not letting insulin affect itself. So the pancreas says, well, I gotta produce more, and it produces more insulin. And now you got insulin resistance because you got sick fat cells that aren't doing their job. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Woo! You now know more than most of the endocrinologists in Arizona. I am so impressed. All right. I hope there's no endocrinologists here. I just offended a bunch of them, I'm sure. All right. So that's glucose 101. That's where insulin resistance comes from. It comes from sick fat cells, not a bad pancreas. And until we fix that, you're going to have a problem. Now, what happens if we take away your sugar? You actually decrease your insulin loads, and you produce something called ketones, which is a byproduct of fatty metabolism. And guess what? Ketones are really cool because they also act like hormones, and they suppress these overproduction. This is why I was so shocked when exogenous ketones started being used, and I had patients' blood sugars totally normalized within 2 weeks, and I went, what? And because when a person got into ketosis, or they were using products that allowed the ketone to be present, we're suddenly changing the dynamics back. And this is why I'm such a big fan of being in a ketogenic state. You can do low carb, yes, but you're not going to change disease until you're in ketosis. And that's why I'm a big fan of being in a ketogenic diet. Does that make sense?
Yes.
All right. Seriously, you now know more physiology than I knew when I came out of medical school. So that's why I wrote a book. And basically what I did, when I first came out of school, I started doing 2-hour glucose tolerance tests, but I was checking insulin as well. And the labs hated my guts because I was sticking people all the time. It was like, all those who've been pregnant and had that 2-hour glucose tolerance test, if you've had that, raise your hand. Yes, okay, you know what I'm talking about. That yummy 75 grams of glucose you drink, and then you sit there forever and you get lightheaded, dizzy, and they stick you 12 times. Well, a guy named Joseph Kraft did it 13,000 times, but he did it for 5 hours. And between what he saw and what I saw, what we identified is that, if you're a normal, your insulin when you're fasting should really be less than 5, not 20 like the lab says. And when after 2 hours after a meal, your insulin should drop to less than 40. But most of my patients, 90% of them, are somewhere in here. When they're fasting, their insulin's up around 15, 30, 40. I had one guy that came in with 110. He's clear up past here. Now, we arbitrarily call diabetes right here. When your fasting insulin's over 30, that's your type 2 diabetic. And this is actually 25 years into the process. You've already had all this damage occurring because of high insulin loads for 20 to 25 years before you ever get that diagnosis of, oh, no, you're diabetic. It's an arbitrary number. The problem is not diabetes. The problem is overproduction of insulin. That's type 2 diabetes. Type 1 diabetes is they're not producing any insulin. Two different things altogether, but hopefully that makes it clear for you. All right. And then like my father, after a while his pancreas burns out, and then we have to start giving him a ton of insulin in order to compensate for his pancreas that then burned out. So I don't want to demonize insulin because you need a little bit of it. But when you have a lot of it, these are all the really cool diseases that arise. This is what keeps me in business. This is actually job security, by the way. So excess insulin causes weight gain. It increases the sodium retention and causes your blood pressure to go up. Not your salt, it's your insulin. It raises uric acid, causes calcium oxalate. We call those kidney stones. We also call it gout. Small dense LDL particle goes up every single time. Insulin directly stimulates oxidation of the cholesterol molecule and causes that to change in the small dense particle, leading to atherogenesis. That's the next step in the process. Increases triglycerides, increases free radicals. These are not the terrorist type. These are the ones that cause cancer. We're going to talk about thyroid here in a minute, and then it lowers estrogen in women, raises estrogen in men, and does the opposite with testosterone, turns men into women and women into men. And I see that almost every day. And then lastly, it increases inflammation. I'm amazed that I see 50% reduction in pain from arthritis within a few weeks of being in a ketogenic diet with many of my patients who are over 65. So pretty impressive. All right, so this is a gluten-free salad. Doctors say that each piece of bacon you eat takes 9 minutes off of your life, and if that was the case, I should have died in 1731. So let's define a low carbohydrate diet, because nobody defines this. And if you're going to talk about a ketogenic diet, you at least have to have something like this up on your slides. So number one, paleo is carbohydrate restricted to somewhere between 100 and 250 milligrams. The reason the CrossFit guys love it is because they do so much exercise that puts them into ketosis periodically, and they can get away with that many carbs. But I can't, nor can many of my really insulin-resistant patients. Second is a low-carb diet, which is what a lot of us started out with, is 100 grams or less. A very low carbohydrate diet, which is what I was trained with originally, is less than 50 grams. And then truly to be ketogenic, for many of us who are very insulin resistant like I am, you've got to lower that carb intake to less than 20 grams per day, or you ain't getting there. And that's the challenge that I see. So everybody get that? So that's the world that's the ketosis world according to Dr. Nally. Now, you may see how docs define that slightly different, but that's really what I do. All right, correct rules on adulting. Pay your bills, don't do meth, and eat bacon every day. Now, why do I say that? Because one of the biggest factors that affects your thyroid is autonomic dysfunction. You may have a fairly normal thyroid, but if you're under the fight or flight response, which is what your autonomic dysfunction does, you see these changes that occur all the time. And it actually suppresses thyroid function as well as many other hormones and raises insulin. So just being under constant stress will actually affect insulin, it will affect sex hormones, and it will affect your insulin. And now, primary job number one, in my office, we fix the insulin first. If you don't fix the insulin, you can't fix anything else, period. The insulin has to be fixed first. And if you're saying, Doc, I'm still not doing okay, and we treated my thyroid and we treated my testosterone, but if you're still having a ding-dong every third day, you're not gonna see success. You've gotta bring the insulin down first before the other effects will happen. All right, so this is the thyroid level, and we'll take a little time here. So your body at the hypothalamus produces TRH. TRH, it stimulates this little hanging down thing in the middle of your brain called the pituitary gland. And that gland then produces thyroid-stimulating hormone, which most doctors are really good at measuring and telling you, oh, you're fine. But that hormone then stimulates two hormones, T4 and T3. Now, the thyroid produces a small amount of T3, only about 20%. And the 80% is T4. We're going to talk a little bit about that, but this T4 is converted into T3 and then acts like the gas pedal for your body, for every cell in the body, and it increases the metabolism or decreases depending on what T3 is. Hopefully that's simplistic enough to understand your thyroid function. Now, these are the hormones that you may get measured. Most docs will measure these first couple hormones here, but we also want to see what your free T3 is. We want to see occasionally what's bound. When these hormones float through your blood system, only a percentage of them are loose and free available to be used. The rest of them are bound to a hormone called thyroid binding globulin, and they're not accessible. They're just, until the body pulls them off, you can't access them. Then there's this really cool molecule called reverse T3, which is actually a conversion from T4 to T3, but it's an inactive form, and we're going to talk about why insulin affects that. And then there's thyroid antibodies. Now, the thyroid is a very vast and somewhat complex disease process if diseases arise, and we'll briefly touch on that, and I don't want to do a dissertation on it, but I want you to understand some basics. So we have two active forms of thyroid hormone. There's a T4 that's made, and there's a T3, and it's the free components of these two that drive your metabolism. Every cell in the body gets these, and then turns up the metabolism, turns down the metabolism based on the level of those. If the T4 is converted into the inactive form, this does nothing but hang out and get dumped out in your bile. So this becomes inactive, but it's present. So we want to be aware of those three forms that are there. So what happens if your thyroid is diseased? Well, number one, you can have inflammation of the thyroid, and this is Hashimoto's or Graves' disease. This is an antibody that attacks your thyroid as if it's sick. You have your own immune system attacks your thyroid and causes the thyroid to either be overfunctioning or underfunctioning. I'm going to leave it at that. It's that simple, but that's really what autoimmune thyroiditis is. Second, you can have iodine deficiency. Excessive iodine can actually cause both to happen. And if you're deficient in iodine, you can actually have hypothyroid symptoms. So we need to make sure that's okay. You can have underfunctioning or low-functioning thyroid, and you can have overfunctioning thyroid. Those are basically the four. There is a fifth. You can have thyroid cancer. I'm not going to touch on that. Those are really the five things that essentially happen with your thyroid. And people ask me about thyroid all the time in doing ketosis, so this is why I put these 5 things up here, because these are the 5 things that happen most commonly. So let's touch a little bit on thyroiditis. I just want you to understand that this is multiple antibodies, and there are 3 of them specifically that can affect the thyroid gland and can cause over or under functioning of the thyroid. If you've heard of Graves' disease, this is an antibody to the TSH receptor. If you've heard of Hashimoto's, it's one of these 2 or both that are being affected by your immune system, and it causes either over or under functioning of that thyroid gland. Now, many times it'll be over functioning for a while, then it'll suddenly become under functioning because the thyroid burns out. And so that's what you'll see. So if you have someone tell you I have thyroiditis or I have Graves' disease or I have Hashimoto's, they have an autoimmunity attacking the thyroid, and it'll eventually cause them to be under functioning in many cases. Some that are over functioning are so bad we have to actually remove the thyroid, but we won't go into that. All right. So, what factors cause thyroiditis? Well, these are all the really cool things that we're exposed to on a daily basis that can cause you to form antibodies to your thyroid. Interestingly enough, we put this in our water. We give this as drugs. This used to be in fillings in our teeth. We use this all the time to cook bacon. I don't anymore, but a lot of people do. Excessive iodine intake can do it. All sorts of chemicals, phthalates. These are actually what make your plastic soft. So that soft plastic can actually affect that. Pregnancy, interestingly enough, can do it. One of my patients said, "Doctor, I have this parasite and it's caused my thyroiditis." Genetics, celiac disease, and chronic urticaria. All right, can you see that? That was the wake up to make sure you're not sleeping from lunch. All right. So now, how do you lower thyroid antibodies? In my office, we used to just wait, twiddle our thumbs, and hopefully they would occur. In 1 year, usually 60% of people's thyroid antibodies will dissipate on their own. The other 40% never go away. At least that's what I saw statistically. Interestingly enough, though, there's some literature now that talks about the fact that if you cut out the carbs, you optimize your gut health, and we give you selenium, glutathione, and rosmarinic acid, it actually dramatically decreases the frequency with which those antibodies occur. So in my office, this is one of the protocols that we use to help thyroiditis. All right. Now, gut health is important because butyrate, which is what comes from butter, that's why butter was named, actually feeds that gut and allows the gut to be less insulin resistant and allows the gut microbiome, which was talked about already wonderfully by Peter, in helping us to understand how our gut processes a lot of these other foods that we eat and allows for good gut function. I won't go into that, but that plays a big role in thyroiditis in some people, so we do focus on that. So you know far more than you know, and deep down you really know you want another piece of bacon. All right, so under-functioning, low-functioning thyroid. These are all the really cool signs and symptoms that may arise. I didn't put them in order of frequent occurrence, but they do occur frequently. The most common that I see are weight gain, depression, constipation, alligator skin. I will see brittle nails. I see poor memory. I'll see fatigue as a big one. Those are all things that can happen if your thyroid's under-functioning. And like I said, there's multiple causes that can do that, and we won't go into that. Interestingly enough, I've seen this multiple times. Before we had TSH testing, if you lost the outside third of your eyebrows, like Queen Anne, you probably had hypothyroidism. I see this very commonly. An increased fat pad right over the collarbone is also a sign of hypothyroidism, poor functioning thyroid. Hair loss, turn down corners of the mouth, common for hypothyroidism. These are all things you might see. And then hair loss from the lower legs. That can also occur if you wear cowboy boots, just telling you that. Not hypothyroidism. Dry scaly ears and excess cerumen formation, and then a delayed reflex. So these are things that we look for as physicians when we're looking for hypothyroidism. All right, what decreases the function of your T4? So you make this hormone, it tells the thyroid to produce T4. What can cause decreased function of T4? Well, if you're deficient in zinc, and guess what? Zinc comes from red meat. So does copper. That's where you find it. So if you're a vegetarian, I see a lot of hypothyroid vegetarians. Vitamin A comes from eggs and oysters. They're really good on the half shell. Your B vitamins come from salmon, fish, and also red meat, and especially if it's grass-fed. And then vitamin C, I had to change my position on this. If you eat grass-fed steak, you actually get adequate, I gotta go back. You actually get adequate vitamin C from grass-fed beef. So that's a plus. So you can actually get adequate vitamin C to support that. If it's not grass-fed, it's literally a fourth of the vitamin C in that red meat. So just be aware of that. Those all will decrease, though, your production of T4. So let's look for a second. All right, there are actually 3 enzymes that affect this conversion of T4 to T3. Number 1, these are called deiodinases, and this enzyme is found mainly in the thyroid, liver, and kidney, and it's suppressed by higher insulin. As your insulin goes up and your leptin goes up, this enzyme works less. Now, this enzyme is found in all of the cells of your body except for the pituitary and brown fat. There's a different enzyme in the pituitary and brown fat. And the challenge is that if you're insulin resistant, you stop producing T4 to T3 in the body, but you make plenty in the brain, and when we measure it in the brain, it says, oh, your thyroid gland's normal. But in the body, it's going, well, we're not. And so the challenge is that increased insulin makes this work better, it makes this work less. So how do you know if your fat cells are overproducing leptin and you're really insulin resistant that you're not truly hypothyroid even though your TSH and your T4 are normal? Because if there's no, this feedback mechanism right here, if I can find my pointer, from T4 tells the brain how well you're producing T4. But if this conversion's broken, your brain never knows that. And you may not know that if you don't check the actual free T3 or you don't check the reverse T3. So if this shuts down, then what ends up happening is this enzyme kicks in and produces a really cool hormone called, I gotta wait for this to all happen, reverse T3. Now remember, reverse T3 is inactive. This one doesn't work, but you're making it. But the cells of your body aren't, and so you'll see weight gain, and you'll see dry skin, and you'll see hair loss, and you'll see constipation, you'll see all the signs of hypothyroidism, yet your TSH and your T4 are normal. So the challenge is to really truly see if your thyroid's working, you need to check all these hormones. You gotta look at them all. And if you're not, you're missing part of the issue, especially if you're insulin resistant. Now the really cool thing is that at least 50% of my patients that have abnormal thyroid function, within about 3 or 4 weeks, they will actually see normalization of their thyroid function, where this will return to normal when we put them on a ketogenic lifestyle. So it's actually pretty amazing to see that. I never thought I'd say that, but I just said it. All right, so what actually suppresses that type 1 deiodinase? These are all really exciting things that depress that function. Poor selenium, high carb intake, that's the cake you just ate. The stress does it. Cadmium, mercury, lead toxicity. Prolonged fasting. This is one of the reasons I'm not a big fan of fast longer than 2 weeks. There's a couple studies that show that reverse T3 starts to rise after 2 weeks of prolonged fasting. And it's a protective mechenism for the body, and that's why it does that. If you're not eating enough protein, the vegetarians and vegans in my office, this is huge. That's why they all come in with hypothyroidism. Chronic illness will do it. Inflammation does it. Liver dysfunction, iodine deficiency, and iron deficiency all play a role with that poor conversion and increased reverse T3 that's not active that your body can't use. What medicines do this? Just about every patient in my office is on one of these beta blockers. Steroids do it. Birth control pills, yes. The artificial progesterone does it to you. Estrogen excess. If you drink, most of the women that come in my office are estrogen dominant because of the exposures to plastics and and their birth control pills. And this estrogen excess lowers it. Lithium does it. Phentoin, theophylline, and interestingly, that one little exciting hormone that's overproduced by your fat cells when you're obese. All right. So diet suppressing conversion of T4 to T3. If you eat too much broccoli or cauliflower, it'll do it. Excessive amounts, and this is why I think the carnivore movement has had success, is because a lot of people are so convinced they have to have at least some leafy greens, they eat a lot of them. And it actually causes hypothyroidism and slows down the metabolism. Well, when you back that off a little bit and you eat less, you don't really need that much, then you actually see an improvement in thyroid function. Too little protein in the diet will affect it. Very low fat diets or prolonged fasting, again, starvation issues. Alcohol does it to you. Yes, I'm sorry, all alcohol. Even if it's the keto approved alcohol, it still does it. Walnuts, soy, fluoride, phthalates, and lead do it. All right, how am I on time? All right, the elevated tumor necrosis factor alpha, interleukin 6, and interferon 2, these all go up with insulin resistance, type 2 diabetes, obesity, Alzheimer's, interesting enough, Parkinson's, and aging does it to a small degree. Prolonged fasting for longer than 2 weeks also changes the conversion of that, or increases the presence of that reverse T3. I've said that twice now. And then amazingly, stress from anxiety and depression. You stimulate that autonomic nervous system. It used to be the only time that the autonomic nervous system was stressed was when the bear reared up in front of you in the woods and you either had to fight the bear or run from the bear. Now that bear is someone cuts you off in the street, you get a bill collector calls you, your kid is at school, something happens, you watch the news with this 24-hour news cycle. This is a big deal. That autonomic stimulus plays a big role in suppression of thyroid function. And then metal exposures are another one. All right, I bolded, which you may not be able to see very well, the most common metals that are a problem. If your selenium is correct, you improve the conversion. If you have enough potassium, it does. If you're potassium deficient, it doesn't. That's why your salt is so important. Because when you start doing keto and you start producing, remember when you burn fat, you produce carbon dioxide, which you breathe off, and water, and you got to urinate that off. Well, the only way to get the water to go out of your system is to put salt in the kidney, and water's like the boyfriend for salt, it follows it around. So it goes into the kidney and then you pee it out. Well, you're using potassium, sodium, magnesium, and zinc. You're also losing selenium and some manganese. And you have to replace those. And if you're not replacing those, then you will see some change in thyroid function. Iodine, iron, zinc, manganese, I talked about that. There was one other on here. Well, I won't go into that. But anyway. All right. So lastly, just a reminder, if your T4 itself has little activity. It's not really active. It has to be converted into T3. The conversion from T4 to T3 is mainly in the liver and the kidneys, and that's by the type 1 deiodinase. And if that deiodinase is inactivated because of high insulin and or high leptin, or both, then you're going to see hypothyroidism arise. Number two, the T3 is literally 5 times stronger than T4. And so once you convert to that T3 is a really good gas pedal. It's like stomping the gas. And it lets the cell metabolism work more effectively. Lastly, the direct effects on the mitochondrial function affect this pretty significantly. So if your mitochondria isn't working, and we get to hear really cool stuff from Dr. Beekman about mitochondria, that's what he specializes in, this is essential for your thyroid to function. And if you don't have adequate mitochondrial function, then you're not going to have good conversion to that T3, and that's important to understand. So, well, Dr. Nally, how do I lose fat? All right, so grab your bootstraps, tighten them on tighter, because I'm going to tell you there are 5 back doors to the fat cell, and there's 1 front door. The front door is insulin. When your insulin drops, you stop pushing fat into the cell. When insulin goes up, insulin is the only hormone that pushes triglyceride into the fat cell, and it does it right here. That insulin pushes the insulin, when it's on, pulls fat into the fat cell. If your insulin drops, it actually backs off the CAMP pathway and allows triglyceride to be able to exit more effectively. Number 2, your thyroid hormone. T3 is the second back door to the fat cell. If your T3 is adequate, you will actually let triglyceride out of that fat cell to turn it into ketone really effectively. If it's not working, you're not losing weight. Number 4, or number 3, I should say. Where did it go? Catecholamines. Epinephrine and norepinephrine, these stimulate adenylate cyclase and actually allow that process to occur more normally. Interestingly enough, they also stimulate the heart to squeeze more effectively and release something called atrial natriuretic peptide, which actually increases the metabolism as well. Number 4, testosterone. Most of the men in my office have very low testosterone when their insulin's high, and women with PCOS have high testosterone and low estrogen, and that actually has a reverse effect. That also is door number 4 to let the fat out. And then number 5 is sympathomimetics. Ketones act as a sympathomimetic. They act as a signaling hormone to the fat cell to allow GPR41 to change the way leptin is used, decrease appetite, and allow you to let more triglyceride out of the fat cell. That's why it's important. So the presence of ketone and short-chain fatty acids, which is butyrate, butter, allow this to happen. Now, I'm not saying go slather your steak in butter. I'm saying if you're using adequate amounts of fat that include butyrate, then you'll actually see this happen. And then we use some drugs like phentermine to help stimulate that too in some patients. So that's the 5 back doors of the fat cell. So you want to learn how to lose fat, balance those 5 hormone pathways, and you got it. So change starts when someone sees the next step, says my horse. All right. All right, if you have a thyroid problem or you suspect you have a thyroid problem, my suggestion is get your reverse T3 checked. If your reverse T3 is higher than 15, your deiodinase enzyme is not working, and you probably have high leptin or high insulin levels. That's important for you to understand that. So that's a big key that we've learned in the last 5 years about thyroid itself. Number 2, get your mitochondria as healthy as you possibly can. Control the insulin resistance, eliminate stress as much as you possibly can, make sure that you have adequate selenium, get that mitochondria tuned up, and then in some cases we have to replace the T3 in patients that aren't producing enough of it, and so that's usually how we approach it in that regard. And then lastly, I have a lot of patients that I'll put on thyroid hormone, and then all of a sudden they call me up 3 days later and go, oh my gosh, I'm having palpitations, this drug is horrible. Well, they're often low in magnesium. So if I give you thyroid hormone and your magnesium's too low because you've been doing a ketogenic diet and you haven't been taking your salt, guess what happens? You get heart palpitations. And so as a side effect, it's usually due to a low magnesium level in a patient who's not adequately replacing salt. Gut health plays a big role there. If you've had a heart attack, your thyroid's going to be out of whack, so don't check thyroid hormone for at least 2 months. And then if you're having increased fatigue, make sure that you're changing up that mitochondria and you're not overdosing the T4. Sometimes we give people T4, which is Synthroid or levothyroxine, and then we'll give them T3 separately. And sometimes you can, if you overdose one and you're underdosing the other, you can actually get similar symptoms as well. So just be aware of that. And that is not me, by the way. I think he had to have his collarbone fixed after that. All right, so mitochondrial dysfunction. If your mitochondria is not working, this is what I commonly see in my office. Chronic migraine headaches that never go away and no one can find an answer to. Chronic fatigue syndrome. I see a ton of this. And it's broken mitochondria. And as soon as we fix the mitochondria, all of a sudden they feel wonderful again. Fibromyalgia. I really think that's a mitochondrial disorder, personally. They have real pain, and there's real issues, but I think that it's significantly related with mitochondria. And then other chronic pain syndromes. This is how I refuel the mitochondria in my office to try to help tune it up and make sure people have adequate nutrients for it, especially on a ketogenic diet. We give them CoQ, oops, didn't mean to do that. Sorry guys, I'll go back. I've got 2 minutes. So CoQ10, deoxyribose, magnesium, NADH if we need to replace it, L-carnitine, which only comes from red meat, by the way, and alpha-lipoic acid. All right, hopefully you got a picture of that if you needed it. Everything should be as simple as possible and no simpler, and so in the next minute and 30 seconds, I'm going to give you the wisdom you need. This is actually a patient sample that he brought to me. He said, Doc, I have this stool sample for you. He pulled it out. That's actually, my patient actually gave me that. It really is important to understand that. So here we go. All right, in my office, this is what we do. We have an 8-step program, not a 12-step program. So number 1, control the insulin resistance. Number 2, moderate your protein. And if you need those calculations, they're on my website or they're in the book or whatever you want to do. We want to balance out protein. I usually start with a protein to fat ratio of 1 to 1. That's grams. That's not calories and percentages. That's not macros. Macros is the second swear word in my office. We do not use macros in my office. We use a 1 to 1 ratio of protein to fat. Red meat is 1 to 1, just the way the good Lord made it. Eggs are 1 to 1, the way the good Lord made them. Bacon is 1 to 1, the way the good Lord made it. And if you have a ratio of 1 to 1 in calories, that's 70% fat. Your egg is 70% fat, your ribeye is 70% fat, your pork is 70% fat, and your bacon is 70% fat. The way the good Lord made them. You don't have to add any extra butter to it. It's already pre-made that way. All right, keep hydrated. Only eat when you're hungry. That's a very important thing. It takes 3 months for people to learn their hunger signals again, I've found. It took me 6 months. Supplements if we need to, fix the gut bacteria, balance that thyroid function, but if you don't do this first, this won't work. Seriously. Been doing this for 20 years, tried it multiple times. Until you fix this, this won't get fixed. And until you fix this, giving you testosterone or other sex hormones is worthless. You're just creating really expensive stool. All right. I think I'm last. I won't go into this clearly. Make sure your doctor watches you because I'm out of time here. Oh, I can keep going? All right. The ketosis killers. Everyone asks me, Dr. Nally, your diet failed. It doesn't work. So this is the next question I ask. All right. Are you eating carbohydrates? No, I'm having bacon. Well, tell me what you had for breakfast this morning. I had oatmeal. Okay, your bowl of oatmeal is 200 grams of carbohydrate. You realize that, right? No, it's good for me. That's oatmeal. Simple carbohydrates, sweeteners. Now, in 20 years of practice, I have found that many of the sweeteners actually spike insulin. And for someone like me, xylitol kicks me out of ketosis every time, as does monk fruit, and as does agave. And aspartame, which actually is a great appetite suppressant, makes the gut bacteria more insulin resistant. So if you're on these, you'll probably not see success, or you may see poor function. And then I have some people that are just taking way too much protein. And remember that protein does have an insulin response. And if someone who's still really insulin resistant is taking too much protein because their bodybuilder trainer told them they were supposed to, then they'll have trouble losing weight. Once you get to where you're much more lean, the body's much more forgiving with protein. But if you're obese and you're insulin resistant, you can eat too much protein and it will make you worse. And I've seen that for 20 years. All right, that is really the weapon of mass destruction. And that's the end.